It was just another Tuesday for Richard Blake as he rode in his luxury car through downtown. Rich, powerful, and always in a hurry, the 40-year-old CEO barely noticed the world outside his tinted windows. That's when something caught his eye, a small boy sitting alone on a bench, clutching what looked like a photograph. Richard wouldn't have given it a second thought, but something made him pause. The boy couldn't have been more than 7, with worn-out clothes and shoes that had seen better days. But it wasn't his appearance that made Richard's heart stop, it was what he held in his small hands. A photograph showing a woman who looked exactly like his wife Jennifer, holding a baby. Richard froze, his hand already reaching for the door handle. "Stop the car," he ordered his driver, his voice barely audible over the pounding in his chest. As the vehicle pulled to the curb, Richard stepped out, his legs feeling strangely weak. The boy didn't look up as he approached, too focused on tracing the woman's face in the photo with his finger. Richard cleared his throat, trying to find words that wouldn't frighten the child. "That's a nice picture," he said finally, pointing at the photograph. The boy looked up, his eyes widening slightly at the man in the expensive suit. "It's my mom," he responded simply. "And me when I was a baby." Richard carefully sat down, maintaining enough distance not to seem threatening. "What's your name?" he asked, throat suddenly dry. "Michael," the boy replied. "Michael Harris." The surname hit Richard like a physical blow. Harris was his wife's maiden name. He stared at Michael, suddenly seeing familiar features he should have noticed immediately. The boy had Jennifer's nose, but Richard's eyes and chin. His mind raced with calculations and memories. 8 years ago, Jennifer had taken a 3-month sabbatical after they'd had a massive fight about starting a family. She'd returned changed somehow, more distant, but they'd worked through it. Or so he thought. The boy was staring at him now, curiosity replacing wariness. "Are you okay, mister? You look like you've seen a ghost." Richard managed a weak smile. "Something like that. Can I ask where your mom is?" Michael's face fell, his small shoulders slumping under the weight of whatever burden he carried. "She's in the hospital. She's really sick. That's why I'm staying at the shelter right now." He pointed vaguely toward a building down the street that Richard recognized as the Downtown Children's Haven. "The ladies there are nice, but they say I might have to go to a foster home soon if Mom doesn't." His voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Richard noticed a small birthmark on the boy's wrist as he pointed, a crescent moon shape identical to his own. Without thinking, Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "Michael, I'd like to help you and your mom. Would it be okay if I talk to the people at your shelter?" The next few days passed in a blur for Richard as he pieced together the truth. His security team verified everything. Jennifer Harris, age 36, was indeed in Memorial Hospital with stage 4 cancer. She'd been a single mother raising Michael since his birth 7 years ago. The timeline matched perfectly with their separation. Richard sat in his office, staring at the DNA test results confirming what that birthmark had already told him. Michael was his son. A son Jennifer had kept from him for nearly 8 years. Anger, grief, and confusion warred within him. Why had she hidden this? Was this her final revenge for how terribly he'd treated her back then? He'd been young, arrogant, focused only on building his empire. When she'd suggested starting a family, he'd cruelly dismissed the idea. Richard stood outside Jennifer's hospital room, heart hammering against his ribs. He'd arranged for her to be moved to a private room with the best care possible, but he hadn't visited until now. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. She looked so much smaller than he remembered, her once vibrant figure now fragile against the white hospital sheets. Her eyes widened when she saw him, a mix of fear and resignation crossing her face. "I met Michael," he said simply, remaining by the door. Jennifer closed her eyes briefly, a tear escaping down her pale cheek. "I always knew this day would come," she whispered. "I just thought I'd have more time to prepare him." Richard moved closer, pulling a chair up to her bedside. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question that had burned in him for days. She met his gaze steadily despite her weakness. "Because you made it very clear children weren't part of your plan. And I couldn't bear to see you reject him like you rejected the idea of us having a family." Her words struck him like a slap, but he couldn't deny their truth. "I've changed," Richard said, surprising himself with how genuine those words felt. Meeting Michael had shifted something fundamental inside him. "I was wrong back then, Jennifer. So wrong about everything that matters." She studied his face, searching for signs of the arrogant young man she'd left. "Michael needs someone," she said finally. "The doctors say I have weeks, maybe months. I've been trying to figure out what happens to him after." Richard reached out hesitantly, taking her thin hand in his. "Let me be his father, Jen. Really be his father." Her eyes welled with fresh tears. "You don't know the first thing about being a parent." He nodded, acknowledging the truth. "You're right. But I want to learn. And I'm hoping you can help me, for whatever time we have." The fragile hope that bloomed in her expression nearly broke him. Richard left the hospital that evening with a promise to return the next day, with Michael. As he drove home to his empty mansion, he realized how hollow his success felt. All the wealth he'd accumulated couldn't buy him more time with Jennifer, or replace the years he'd lost with his son. For the first time in decades, Richard Blake, billionaire CEO, cried. The first meeting between Richard and Michael as father and son was awkward, filled with long silences and uncertain glances. They sat in the hospital cafeteria, Michael picking at a sandwich while Richard struggled to find words that could bridge 7 years of absence. "Your mom told you about me?" he finally asked. Michael nodded, not looking up. "She said you were really busy building important things." Richard winced at the simplicity and kindness of Jennifer's explanation. "That was true," he admitted. "But I didn't know about you. If I had—" Michael finally looked up, his eyes serious beyond his years. "Would you have wanted me?" The directness of the question knocked the breath from Richard's lungs. "Yes," he said firmly, realizing as he spoke that nothing in his life had ever been more certain. "I would have wanted you more than anything in the world." Something in Michael's expression softened slightly. "Mom says you're going to take care of me when she can't anymore." Richard nodded, his throat tight. "If that's okay with you." Michael considered this, his small face solemn with the weight of adult problems no child should have to bear. "I don't want Mom to go away," he whispered, his voice breaking. Richard felt his heart crack open. "I don't want that either," he said honestly. "But if she does, I promise you won't be alone." Michael studied him with those eerily familiar eyes. "Mom says promises are really important. That you should never make one you can't keep." Richard swallowed hard, understanding the test being offered. "I keep my promises, Michael. Always." It wasn't entirely true, he'd broken his marriage vows, after all, but he knew with absolute certainty that this was one promise he would die before breaking. Michael seemed to accept this, nodding slightly before returning his attention to his sandwich. Later, when they visited Jennifer's room together, Richard watched in awe as his son transformed from the solemn, wary child of their cafeteria conversation into a bright, animated boy, eagerly telling his mother about the cool car Richard had, and how the driver had let him press the button for the partition. Jennifer's eyes met Richard's over Michael's head, a silent communication passing between them. For the first time, he felt like they might be able to forge something from this broken situation, a family, however unconventional. Over the next weeks, Richard rearranged his entire life around hospital visits and getting to know his son. His executive team was shocked when he announced he'd be working remotely 3 days a week indefinitely. He converted one of his mansion's many unused rooms into a bedroom for Michael, filling it with toys and books. As Jennifer grew weaker, the time the three of them spent together became more precious. One evening, as Michael had fallen asleep in the chair between them, Jennifer reached for Richard's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not being the man I remembered." He shook his head, grief and gratitude mingling. "Thank you for giving me a second chance at being someone worth remembering." The day Jennifer died was cloudless and bright, a cruel contrast to the darkness that descended on Richard and Michael. They stood together at her bedside, the boy's small hand clutched tightly in his father's larger one. Later, Richard wouldn't remember the funeral arrangements he'd made or the people who offered condolences. What he would remember was Michael's face, tear-streaked but determined as he'd placed his mother's favorite flowers on her casket. And the moment in the car afterward when Michael suddenly asked, "What do I call you now?" Richard had turned to him, heart aching with love for this child who was somehow managing to be braver than he felt. "Whatever feels right to you," he'd answered honestly. Michael had considered this for a long moment before saying, "I think I'd like to call you Dad." The adjustment to living together full-time wasn't easy. Michael had nightmares that sent him screaming into the darkness, calling for a mother who would never come again. Richard, who'd never before had to comfort anyone, found himself sitting night after night beside the boy's bed, awkwardly patting his back or reading stories until Michael drifted back to sleep. There were tantrums too, explosive bursts of grief and anger that left toys broken and both of them exhausted. Richard's assistant suggested child psychologists, and he interviewed 7 before finding one Michael would actually talk to. Slowly, painfully, they began to forge a relationship built on shared loss and cautious hope. For the first time in his life, Richard's priorities shifted completely. Board meetings and business deals took a back seat to school pickup and parent-teacher conferences. Richard learned to cook more than just pancakes, to check homework, to enforce bedtimes even when it would have been easier to give in. And Michael learned that this tall, sometimes awkward man who looked so much like him really wasn't going anywhere. 6 months after Jennifer's death, Michael came home from school with a drawing. "It's for you," he said shyly, handing Richard the paper. On it, 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, stood hand in hand in front of what looked like a house. Above them, a smiling yellow sun. And in the sky, a smaller figure with wings. "That's Mom," Michael explained, pointing. "She's watching us." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. "It's beautiful," he managed. "We should frame it." That night, after Michael was asleep, Richard sat in his office looking at the drawing now hanging prominently on his wall. He thought about how Jennifer had been forced to struggle as a single mother while he'd continued amassing wealth, oblivious to his son's existence. The unfairness of it struck him anew. Not just for his family, but for how many others like them. How many single parents were out there right now, working multiple jobs, sacrificing everything for their children. An idea began to form, a way to honor Jennifer's memory and perhaps make some small amends for his failure. The next morning, he made 2 calls. One to his lawyer to begin creating the Jennifer Harris Foundation, dedicated to supporting single parents in crisis, and one to his CFO, instructing him to liquidate one of Richard's personal investment portfolios to provide the initial funding. The day of the foundation's launch, Michael stood beside Richard at the podium, nervously straightening the tie his father had taught him to knot that morning. "My mom always said that when you have more than you need, you build a longer table, not a higher fence," Michael told the crowd, his voice small but steady. Richard blinked back tears, recognizing Jennifer's words and wisdom. As he looked out at the gathered press and dignitaries, he saw not an audience to impress but a means to an end, spreading the word about this mission that had become so personal. "This foundation exists because I was fortunate enough to get a second chance," Richard said into the microphone. "Not everyone does. So we're going to be that second chance for as many families as we can reach." 3 years later, the foundation had helped hundreds of families, and the bond between Richard and Michael had grown unbreakably strong. They still visited Jennifer's grave together on the first Sunday of every month, bringing fresh flowers and telling her about their lives. On this particular Sunday, Michael, now 10 and growing like a weed, placed a framed photograph beside the flowers. It showed Richard and Michael grinning widely, standing in front of the new Jennifer Harris Family Center the foundation had just opened. "I think she'd be proud of us," Michael said, straightening the frame carefully. Richard put his arm around his son's shoulders, marveling at how this child had completely transformed his definition of success. "She'd be proud of you," he corrected gently. "You're so much like her." Michael leaned against him, comfortable in the affection they now shared easily. "But I have your birthmark," he pointed out, "and Mom said I have your stubborn chin." Richard laughed, recognizing the truth in that. "The best of both of us," he agreed. As they walked back to the car, Michael slipped his hand into Richard's, something he still did sometimes when they were alone. "Dad," he asked suddenly, using the term that had become natural over time, "do you think Mom knew we'd end up okay?" Richard considered the question, thinking of the woman who'd loved their son enough to raise him alone rather than force him into an unwanted relationship with his father. "I think she hoped," he answered honestly. "And I think she did everything she could to make it possible." The invitation to speak at Michael's school career day had terrified Richard more than any high-stakes business negotiation ever had. What did fifth graders care about corporate acquisitions or investment strategies? But Michael had insisted, proudly telling his teacher that his dad, used to just build buildings, but now he builds families too. So here Richard stood, awkwardly holding a microphone and facing 30 curious young faces. He'd prepared a child-friendly presentation about architecture and business, but looking at his son's expectant expression in the front row, he set his notes aside. "Before I met my son," he began instead, "I thought being successful meant having the most money or the biggest company." The children leaned forward, sensing a story more interesting than profits and losses. "Then one day, I saw a little boy on a bench, holding a photograph that changed everything." As Richard continued his story, carefully edited for young ears, he watched Michael's face light up with pride. This, he realized, was his true legacy, not the buildings that bore his name or the fortune he'd amassed, but this bright-eyed boy who had taught him that the most valuable things couldn't be bought. After his presentation, one little girl raised her hand. "Are you really a billionaire?" she asked, eyes wide. Before Richard could answer, Michael jumped in. "Yeah, but that's not the important part," his son said firmly. "He's my dad. That's what matters." That evening, as they drove home from school, Richard glanced at Michael in the rearview mirror. "You know, when that girl asked if I was a billionaire today, you said something that made me very proud." Michael looked up from his handheld game, curious. "What?" Richard smiled. "You said being my son was more important than my money." "That's very wise." Michael shrugged, turning back to his game. "Mom used to say that all the time. That love is worth more than money." Richard felt that familiar pang, gratitude mixed with regret for all Jennifer had taught their son in his absence. "She was right," he said softly. "I wish I'd understood that sooner." Michael was quiet for a moment before responding. "But you know it now. And Mom said it's never too late to learn something important." Richard marveled at his son's resilience and wisdom beyond his years. Where he had needed a dramatic wake-up call to recognize what truly mattered, Michael seemed to understand it instinctively. Perhaps that was Jennifer's greatest gift to both of them, teaching Michael directly and teaching Richard through their son. As he parked the car in their driveway, Richard made a decision. "How would you feel about going on a little trip this weekend?" he asked casually. Michael's eyes lit up. "Where to?" Richard smiled, already picturing it. "The children's shelter where I first met you. I thought we might bring some of those games you've outgrown, and maybe spend some time with the kids there." He wasn't prepared for the fierce hug Michael launched at him from the back seat. "Yes. Can we bring ice cream too? Mom always said ice cream makes everything better." Now as Michael approaches his teenage years, Richard sometimes takes out that worn photograph, the one that stopped him in his tracks that fateful day. Jennifer's smile still makes his heart ache with regret for the years they might have had together as a family, if only he'd been a different man back then. But those regrets are balanced by profound gratitude for the second chance he'd been given. Last week, Michael had brought home a school assignment, a family tree. Together, they'd filled in all the branches they knew, but when they reached the space for Michael's future, the boy had hesitated. "Do you think I'll have kids someday, Dad?" he'd asked. Richard had smiled, remembering how terrified he'd once been of exactly that question. "If you're lucky," he'd answered truthfully. "They'll change your life in ways you can't imagine." Later that night, after Michael had gone to bed, Richard added one more element to the Jennifer Harris Foundation's mission, a college scholarship fund for children being raised by single parents. He named it the Second Chance Fund, in honor of the boy who'd given him exactly that, a second chance to discover what truly matters. The following morning, Michael found him at the breakfast table, reviewing applications for the scholarship. "You look tired," his son observed, pouring himself cereal. Richard smiled ruefully. "Late night. But worth it." Michael nodded sagely. "Mom used to say the best things usually are." Richard reached out and ruffled his son's hair, marveling at how this child, this unexpected gift, had transformed everything. Sometimes Richard wonders what his life would be like if he hadn't looked out his car window that day. If he'd been checking his phone instead, or lost in thought about some business deal. He might have driven right past his own son and never known what he was missing. The thought terrifies him more than any financial collapse ever could. Recently, the foundation opened its 5th family center, this one specializing in medical support for single parents battling illness, a direct response to what Jennifer had faced alone. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Michael had been the one to wield the giant scissors, his face solemn with the responsibility. Afterward, a local reporter had asked him how it felt to be the inspiration behind such a large charitable organization. Michael had considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness before answering. "It wasn't really me," he'd said finally. "It was my mom. And that photograph." The reporter looked confused, but Richard, standing nearby, felt his eyes fill with tears. Because Michael was right, it had been the photograph that started everything. A simple image of a woman and a baby, captured in a moment of love that was powerful enough to change the course of so many lives. That night, Richard had the photograph professionally restored and framed, hanging it prominently in their home. Not as a reminder of what he'd almost lost, but as a testament to what he'd found, the true meaning of wealth, hidden in plain sight all along. This story isn't just about a rich man and a poor boy, it's about the moments that define us. The choices we make when confronted with unexpected truths. The capacity we all have to change, to grow, to become more than we ever thought possible. Had Richard continued driving past that bench, his life would have remained comfortable but empty, filled with possessions but lacking in purpose. Instead, he stopped. He looked. He saw what truly mattered. And in doing so, he discovered that the greatest poverty isn't in an empty wallet, but in an empty heart. The greatest wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in love given and received. As Michael grows toward manhood under his father's watchful eye, he carries his mother's wisdom and his father's determination, a living bridge between two people who found their way to love too late, and yet just in time. What unexpected photograph might be waiting in your life? What moment of truth stands ready to transform everything, if only you pause long enough to see it? The world is full of Richards, racing through life accumulating wealth and status while missing the chance to build something far more valuable. And it's full of Michaels too, holding photographs of possibilities that haven't yet been realized. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to stop, to look closer, to allow yourself to be changed by what you see. Because the most beautiful journeys often begin when we least expect them, with a glance out a window, a chance encounter, a photograph that makes us question everything we thought we knew about what truly matters in this one precious life we're given. Have you ever wondered how a single moment can completely transform your life? That's what happened when Richard saw Michael holding that photograph, a split second that changed everything. But here's the real question. What photographs are you missing in your own life? What connections are waiting to be made if only you'd look up from your busy day? The truth is, we're all rushing through life, focused on the next goal, the next achievement, the next milestone. But what if the most valuable things aren't ahead of us at all? What if they're right beside us, waiting to be noticed? Perhaps it's a relationship that needs healing, a passion you've abandoned, or a purpose you've yet to discover. Maybe your photograph moment isn't about finding a child you never knew existed, but about truly seeing the people already in your life. Are you present with them, or are you distracted by less important things? Are you measuring your success by what you own, or by who you love and who loves you in return? These questions might feel uncomfortable, but they're the ones that matter most. Because at the end of our lives, we won't wish for more money or bigger houses. We'll wish for more time with the people who make our lives meaningful. Today, I challenge you to look for your own photograph moments, those opportunities for connection and growth that you might be overlooking. It could be as simple as really listening to a loved one instead of scrolling through your phone, or reaching out to someone you've lost touch with. It might mean reconsidering what success truly means to you, or finding ways to use your resources to help others, just as Richard did with the Jennifer Harris Foundation. Whatever it looks like for you, don't wait for a dramatic wake-up call. Choose to see what matters now, while you still have time to embrace it. Your version of wealth might be hiding in plain sight, just waiting for you to recognize its true value. If this story touched something in you today, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Have you experienced your own photograph moment? Or are you still waiting for that wake-up call? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story that might just change how you see your own life. Because sometimes, the most important journeys begin with simply noticing what's been in front of us all along. Until next time, remember, it's never too late to choose what truly matters.